a Tully's Talk. Today's topic is preschool and school readiness, a topic which is of great interest and importance and to both educators and parents, and one which is not readily understood. It's quite a complex topic indeed, and I would say my interest and passion in the subject began many years ago when, after graduating from Teachers College, my first few years of teaching actually was in the prep class, first year in school. You have to understand, in Victoria, in Australia, we have a very young school entry age of 5 before April. And that, in comparison to other countries around the world, is really young. And so to begin your formal school learning at that age is something that not everyone is able to cope with very well, and hence the important decision. When I began teaching and I saw that so many children were arriving in the prep classroom so ill-equipped and so not ready to be sitting at a desk, it was very sad. And when the opportunity came to go further down into the preschool level to help children, one of the reasons that I grabbed that opportunity was to make sure that children were well equipped and ready to move into the school transition. And that was many years ago, and I spent 15 years in the working with 4 to 5 year olds. And then when the opportunity to go down to 3-year-olds and then even 2.5-year-olds arose, I took that up as well. So what's all the fuss about? Let's see. The rationale is that the impact of children arriving at school without the skills needed for the learning program extends far beyond the initial school years. In fact, the likelihood of them successfully completing school and gaining employment and becoming a productive, socially well-adjusted citizen can be traced right back to a child's skills and readiness at school entry. And this is from the Royal Children's Hospital Rethinking School Readiness Policy Brief. So it's so important that we want every year that a child is attending, whether it's preschool or school, it should be a successful one and one where they feel that they're ready for it. Now, children can certainly struggle in any level at 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old for many different reasons, not necessarily because they're young or ill-equipped, but to struggle for the simple reason that they weren't ready and that they were too young for their cohorts is simply unacceptable. It's so unfair for them, and it's something that's so easily preventable. So this is why the interest in this subject is something that we can certainly be more aware of and be able to have a greater impact and influence on children's outcomes and well-being. So what does being ready mean in educational terms? Every stage, every developmental stage has its norms and acceptable behaviour. And so it can apply to any area of a child's life and development. 2-year-old, 3-year-old, babies all have sort of accepted, they have a wide range. So it's normal for a child to walk between even 9 months to 15, 16. But once you're getting up to 22 months, it's a little out of the norm. And if they're starting to walk at 8 months, it's also equally a little out of it. So that's what being ready. And yeah, so we've discussed that. Your child is sufficiently equipped developmentally to move on to the next stage of his education. So what we want to hope is that once a child has established or got the skill or the developmental level that they've reached, that they are ready then to move on to the next level. We want at each stage of their schooling or childcare experience that they've completed, they're ready, they're rearing to go. The ones who haven't quite got that confidence, that know-how, the skill, they haven't quite caught up, they haven't quite grasped it, they perhaps are not ready to move on to the next stage in education. They haven't consolidated what they needed to consolidate first. So that explains what we're talking about. So the question is, what factors contribute to a child's school readiness? Is it nature? You'll say, oh, my child's always like that, or it's biological, that's genetic factors, that's the way they're made up. Or is it nurture? Is it things that we can do as adults, as teachers, as parents to help them develop faster or reach milestones quicker? So the answer to that, unsurprisingly, is very simply a combination of both, or all of them. So there's 3 theories of child development, and I'm not going into that, just very, very, very quickly so we get an understanding of what we're talking about. We've got the maturationalists, which is educational theorists such as Gesell, who says a child will develop according to his biological clock. You can't push the development. You can't make a 1-year-old start to walk before they're ready to walk or talk, toilet train. They have to be ready within themselves. The next one is the environmentalists or the behaviorists, such as Skinner, Bandura. They say that a child's ability to adjust to his environment, to the rules and expectations, will determine how well they're able to cope. So if we have high expectations of them, and the children's able to cooperate and they've picked up on all of that, all the expectations of their environment, of their school, that's going to help them move on to the next stage. And the last one, say children develop by the adults who are setting the environment to meet the children's needs, and that's Vygotsky and Montessori. So they believe a child doesn't have to be biologically ready. They don't have to adjust to the environment, but we as adults need to help children. So it doesn't matter what their standard is, what their level of development is. We have to be able to set up the environment to meet them. That's a very popular one today. But the question I have with that one, or we can have with that one, is often when we have exams and when we get further up in the educational ladder, necessarily our students have to meet the needs of what the norms are of the set curriculum and of what is expected of them. And that's when sometimes it doesn't necessarily work in their interest, when up until then we've been structuring everything for their needs. So what we really know is that it's all of the above that will help determine whether a child is ready. Yes, how mature and how well developed are they? Are they the ones who catch on the milestones quickly? They're the mature children. Even with my own children, I had a child who was, let's say, born in March, who was an old man from the day he was born. He was a thinker. He was rational. He didn't jump into things. He wasn't spontaneous. And yet his brother, born very similar time, a few years before him, he was quick. He was spontaneous. He didn't think. He got into trouble. He was immature. He had an immature biological clock. So obviously that affected whether they were ready each individually to go up or not, or to repeat, or to stay, to be held back. So that's that. And then there's also then what are our expectations? If your child's a firstborn, a secondborn, youngest in the family, what do we expect of them? So the ones still with the dummy and with the emotional needs that they've been very much perhaps babied and nurtured more, they may not be quite as ready as the one whose parents have given them a lot of independence. They're the oldest in the family. They've had lots of expectations. They've been helping around, let's say, more. So that's the environment, how that affects a child's readiness. And the third factor that affects the readiness is obviously the school setting. One of the questions we ask ourselves is, look at the class structure where your child is going to. A, do the school want 2.5 to 3-year-olds or 4.5 to 5-year-olds, or do they prefer, is a curriculum, is the environment set up for them to be of a higher, a state school may have a low expectations than a private school. They may allow them to play for the first half a year. Ask the age of the class. Are they very young, or is everyone in that class going to be a year older? So that's something else that you would be wanting to find out about. Is nowadays it is the norm to hold back, to wait for our children to be a bit older. So that you have to think that is your child going to be at a great disadvantage where his peers are exactly a whole year older? And that's something we've got to really take into account. The questions. Now, I think the easiest way to tackle this subject is by addressing the many questions that parents ask. There will most likely be a lot of questions that you have, but as I said, this, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but this is not a one-size-fits-all. This is a general, I'm covering the subject in a very general way, and often I do, I do PDs, and I do consulting, meeting children, assessing them, and I've got lots of different assessments for different age groups of different expectations, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, and very importantly, obviously, that decision before going to school. So yeah, so that's also of a very individual nature. But in a general way, these are the questions that parents often ask. Hope you'll find them useful. So the first question is, how do I know if my child is ready? There's many factors that we take into account. We don't look at just one area of development, but we look at the child holistically. There would need to be a few factors that are showing to be a little undeveloped for us to make that decision. So let's look at these are the areas in child development that we look at. Most parents and many teachers as well look at these two areas, the cognitive, the intellect, and the language skills, and they would judge and they would make a decision based on those skills. But these are actually the areas which are of greatest importance. The social skills and independence and the self-identity, all those social emotional areas is what we are really looking at. In fact, I'm going to say something very interesting. Most of us adults think that children go to school to be educated. School's about learning. But if you ask your child what they go to school for, or what they don't want to go to school for, it's mostly to do with social reasons. You ask every one of my children, they would say to you, we go for playtime. Before we go to school, we're thinking, who are we going to play with in the yard? We're very rarely thinking about, will we be able to do our mathematical problems? We'll be able to find our exercise books, but who is going to be our friend and who is out there for us? And how will I cope? And will I be included in play? And will I not be included in play? And so I don't think there's enough emphasis on that, but that is the fact. So what are the sorts of skills we are looking at? We're looking at, if you look at social skills, their behaviour, their manners, their reaction, acceptance of rules and regulations, either acting in a mature way, running around when they could be sitting, not able to respect the rights of others, or they are able to, they're able to show concern, they're able to share, to help, they can play cooperatively and accepted by others. And that's very important. Are they accepted by others in their cohorts, in their group? Obviously, there's heaps more, but this is just an example of some of the social skills. And I'd like to just stop for a second and tell you a story of what happened to me, that I was an extremely intelligent child from an extremely intelligent family. And we were having this discussion and trying to make a decision whether he should go up the next to prep the following year or whether he should be repeating. He was young, but like I said, highly intelligent. And the parents took it, which is very often, unfortunately, the case, they took it like as a personal indication of their failure, which is, we know, so not true. And we couldn't come to any conclusions. And one day, if you observe children the way we are trained to observe children, I noticed the most incredible interaction happening in the home corner where their children were playing, and as all the other kids were saying, let's say his name is Joe, you be the baby, you lie down here, we'll tell you what to do, and then when we tell you to get up from the bed, then you can get up from the bed. And he obediently followed all their requests. And this has happened a couple of times, so I actually told the parents, said, guess what, we don't have to make the decision, not you and not I, but his peers have actually made the decision for us. So whether they can keep up with their group, and we need to be able to lead play sometimes and initiate it, and we also need to know how to follow. Doesn't mean you have to have a boss, but you have to be included and have that respect from your peers in order for you to feel comfortable right throughout your schooling. And that's one thing we have to remember, that a child goes to school for 12 years. So that's why, another reason why to make this decision wisely is so important. Then we've got things like positive self-image, confidence. Their confidence in being able to do things is of vital importance. Like we tend to look at outcomes, like he can read and he knows his letters and he's so interested in numbers, and that's the sort of thing that's easy for us adults to assess. What is harder to assess, and what is of greater importance in a child's, especially we talk about mental health today, is the child's ability to be resilient, stand up for themselves, have confidence, be able to play in express themselves socially acceptable ways, and able to handle transition, changes. Then if they're struggling with changes, they don't like to move on and try new things with confidence, or the ability to persevere, to problem solve, are all the sorts of things that we are looking at. And obviously, as I said, for a 2-year-old, the expectations are different from a 3-year-old, from a 4-year-old. Each one has its norms. Okay, so this is just a little summary of what we've talked about until now. Every level has its own developmental norms. Your teachers, educators are the ones best equipped to help you with that, because we often see our children out of context within their peers. Social emotional factors are the key determining factors. Adults tend to focus on cognitive and language abilities. Holding back is not the answer to all learning issues. And so you wouldn't necessarily hold a child back because their language or their physical skills or some skills are not fully developed. Some children do have learning problems, they have difficulties, and holding them back 2, 3, 4 years won't even make a difference. So that is obviously not the answer. Some parents feel if they hold them back, their cognitive skills and abilities will be greatly enhanced and they'll be at a greater advantage, and that is not always the case. Whilst adults think children come to school to learn, the children focus on their play, and educators look holistically at children when making decisions. There usually will be several areas which will determine your child's readiness and maturity. Okay, question number 2. Should all children, we all talk about children born close to the cutoff date, those ones born in our hemisphere, January, February, March, April, should they all be kept down? So the answer for that is no, not necessarily, but if they are showing signs of immaturity, why not give them that extra benefit of another year, which is just so simple. Every stage in the childhood has its own appropriate developmental norms, and obviously I haven't brought up the point of gender differences, that boys develop, especially in the primary years, they develop later than girls. So we need to consider that as well. Often asked is, can he or she catch up, because it's only halfway the year. We mentioned around halfway through the year we are starting to make those decisions. So the question is, can he catch up? Can they catch up when it's only halfway? And the answer is as such. In May or June, when we are starting to consider this, this is your child and this is their peers. Developmentally, the children are their peers. Perhaps their older peers are that little bit ahead. So the question is, can't they catch up? So this is what we will see happening in November and December. That correct, your child will have developed and grown, but their peers are also. We don't expect them to stop and wait for your children to catch up. They also continue to develop. And this is why what we see happening, and I hear it again and again, and it's quite frustrating, is that beginning of the year, you'll have a parent-teachers interview. It doesn't matter if you're in 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, or 6-year-old level class, and they will say, he struggled in May, in January, February, March, but he's got the hang of it. by May or by June. They've actually got the idea of what it's like to be in that level. But what I try to tell parents is that at the end of the year, your child should be ready, eager, bushy-tailed to go up to the next level. We don't want that every year, that by the middle of the year, they're finally caught up to what the expectations are of that level. And this is sort of signified in this slide. Yes, so this is a very common question, but he's so different at home. And of course, we expect our children to be different at home, where they're ruling the roost and telling us what to do, but they do spend 8 hours a day in a totally different environment. And as they spend so much of their life at school, we want them to be confident and as confident at school as they are at home. So please recognize that, of course, our children are more comfortable and confident and unconditionally loved at home. So yeah, what we're interested in is in how they're coping in the school environment, because obviously we can't make home school and school home. So the next question is, won't my child be bored? And that is a very valid question. So the few things that I would say is, number one, make sure if you've got an opportunity to be in a different class, so they're having that opportunity, that's great. They don't have to repeat it in the same environment, but it should be a stimulating preschool setting. And a very interesting thing which people don't realize or recognize is that children don't get tired of playing. In fact, the saddest thing is watching the preps and grade ones staring over the fence and dying to get into the play, and they would do anything to climb over and join in all the creativity and the block building, sandpit. And creativity is never something that you can get bored of. Open-ended activities. You give a bunch of blocks to a 2-year-old and they'll just put them in and out the container, stack up 2 or 3. You give it to a sibling who's 4 and look at what they're going to be able to create. And it's the same with the pencils and drawing and painting. Your child has another opportunity of developing all those skills at a more sophisticated level. So that's called open-ended play. The adults are bored. Parents are in a rush for their child for some reason or other to race through life. But children love repetition. They love the ability to consolidate skills. How many times I give you the same book to read and they're so excited because they can tell you what's going to happen next. And that is what actually gives children the confidence. And I'm just hoping that adults will understand that as well. Is there anything we can do to get him ready? Depends. If it's young, so the biological clock that's ticking and we were just waiting for it to bake, the cake to bake, not really. Just if there is anything we can do, if we see that often you've got children who are older, who have, let's say, born in September, and you're sort of expecting them to do more, so be able to achieve, or why they seem to be not as confident. And often we'll see it becomes from our expectations. So if we do have high expectations, generally from children, not even turning to school readiness, it can always benefit them greatly. So yes, there's lots of things we can do, but if it's a maturational thing that they're not quite ready, then that just needs to bake a little longer in the oven. Should we wait another year to decide? That's a very good question, and that's a hard one. Obviously, the most crucial age is between 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds. You don't want children to start school, and that's why you said I told you about my whole history. We don't want them to start school and formal learning if they still need to play. And that's another thing. That's one of I do lots of assessments, and one of the assessments I ask is your child really wanting to learn, or are they really showing more interest in the creative their development and concepts, and not quite ready for the sitting down and reading, writing books. So should we wait another year to decide? The younger that you make the decision, obviously the better, because as the children get older, it becomes more of a stigma and they have greater understanding, and it's much more difficult. With my own child, I had a child who I believed should have stayed down, but at that stage I was younger and perhaps I didn't have the confidence to argue with him and trust my better judgment and say he should stay down. So from preschool, from 2-year-olds to 3-year-olds, he was pushed up. From 3-year-olds to 4-year-olds, pushed up. And this went right up until grade 3 level, when finally I put my foot down and actually spoke to him, and I could see he was struggling, and not socially as much as it was hard for him. The concepts were just above his head, which is one of the telling factors when I go back to the slide and said, will he be bored? When they're learning at a particular level and they're young, they're grasping the information, but they're not really comprehending and consolidating it. Giving him that next year to hear the same stories, to hear the same material, which is geared to their level, they're excited because they really actually understand and grasp it. This is what I'm talking about, the child who I had in grade 3. He was struggling to grasp. When we made that decision, he said, thank you. His answer was, thank you. And because he had a good sense of self, he was just very young and immature, he said, if anyone starts to make fun of me, they won't hear the end of it. And I didn't know that, because apparently he told it to another child from his old class whose parent told me. So that's an unusual case that it didn't harm his sense of self, keeping him back, and he had the gumption and resilience to be able to handle that. But obviously it is not an ideal thing. The earlier you hold a child back when you've decided to make that decision, the better it is, because it means another year of struggling and just catching it later, as I mentioned before, halfway through the year. Why not give them that opportunity to enjoy every year and stage of their childhood in that way, when it's relevant to them? Okay, so we're ready to end our talk today, and with this summary, let's go over the main points that we've talked about today. 1, children are often different at home than at preschool. 2, the identity of your child is influenced to a great extent from the child's relationships in social settings, the feedback they're getting from teachers, and obviously the more competent they are, the more positive the feedback, and also from their peers, who are very brutally honest and let them know exactly where they feel they are fitting in. 3, children need to feel success, not stress, challenged but not pressured. They need to have the opportunity to thrive and not survive. 4, children are very rarely bored by repeating. Rather, they develop greater confidence in being able to do things better. Perhaps adults get bored, but not them. 5, you can't push a child to develop faster. 6, sure, children develop, but the gap remains between their peers. You can't rely necessarily on them catching up. 7, you need to look at child holistically. Many areas of development, what us adults, or ones who are not trained to look so carefully, see are language, but we are looking at social, emotional maturity. As we point out, they're most important, and that's often harder to detect. 8, gender. Girls mature faster than boys. 9, parents' expectations are important. The child's place in the family is some factor that we will look into too. 10, work with your educators. Can they see your child objectively? It's amazing how many parents make the decision without even consulting or asking how their child is really coping. 11, good rule. If in doubt, keep out. You'll be plagued by the same nagging decision each year. 12, I'm not saying that every time. I did mention before, 2-year-olds to 3-year-olds, the younger you keep them down, the better. It is not terrible if they go up to the 3-year-old kinder. They are still young enough to be able to repeat the 3-year-old level again. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And talking about that is 12. If you decide to repeat, be positive, confident in your decision, because your children will pick up your cues. Rather than say we are keeping him down or holding him back, tell yourself we are giving him or her the gift of another year. So, like to end up with, it's a long journey from preschool to year 12. Let's sit back and enjoy the ride. Thank you.